Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. My guest on this episode is Times columnist James Marriott, who meets me at his favourite restaurant to talk about his first book, The New Dark Ages, The End of Reading and the Dawn of a Post-Literate Society. So as I approached the security lady on the door of the National Portrait Gallery, she looked through my bag and when seeing wires and large, heavy-looking objects, exclaimed, "That looks like it's going to explode." I said, "Wait until you see who my guest is." My guest is James Marriott, Times columnist and author of The New Dark Ages, The End of Reading and the Dawn of a Post-Literate Society. James, thank you very much for speaking to me for the first time on the Booking Club, not for the first time on the other podcast, shall we say. Pleasure to meet you here at Larry's, which is the underground bar restaurant of the National Portrait Gallery, and one that you have specially chosen because, well, why?
Good question. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back in the Jack Aldean extended universe, having done your other podcast. And I don't at all think like you look as if you're the kind of person who's about to blow up the National Gallery. So I want to get that on record. I think you look like you only have benign intentions here. I mean, the obvious and slightly boring pragmatic answer is that this is a always quiet bar in central London where you can have lunch. There is a cynical view of Larry's, which is that it's a little bit like the overpriced cocktail bar of a four-star hotel. And I sort of think, well, maybe it's true. And then you come here and we're sitting in this beautiful room, slightly underground with the sun filtering through the glass ceiling overhead. And I just think this is absolutely delightful. I love the National Gallery. I love museum cafes. I like being close to a museum. I love that they've got all the photographs from the National Portrait Gallery hung over the walls. I do just find it a very pleasant place. And I don't think I'm the only person. I think I saw quite randomly my colleague Fraser Nelson saying how good it was. So I think it has a little bit of a following. But as I say, not too much of one because there are only a couple of other people here. On a Saturday in central London.
London today is so quiet. I wonder where everyone's gone. I mean, I thought this was peak tourist season. But yeah, I love Larry's. The cocktail menu is fantastic. Yes, I love all of the iconic photos that we see on the wall here. And the National Portrait Gallery is one of my favourite parts of central London as it stands anyway. The Booking Club always observes the fact that writers have needed places to retreat from the world, perhaps in public. Would you say that the cocktail bar here has been a place that you maybe have had ideas? Have you ever written here? Has this been an instrumental place to your professional career as a columnist?
No, not at all. I'm afraid this is just a place that I know is useful to go in hectic central London if you're going to the National Gallery. I don't think I've barely ever write in cafes. I find even in a cafe as charming and delightful as this, I find too much noise, too much distraction. I have to be fairly monkish about it. I have to go to the British Library or I have to find a cupboard somewhere in the Times to sit in and write by myself. It seems, suddenly now you mention it, the idea of sitting in Larry's writing a book seems very attractive and romantic, but sadly that's not the way my brain rolls.
You could almost imagine doing it on a day like this. Even then the rattling of cutlery can distract. Distraction is obviously going to be a big theme of our conversation today. The New Dark Ages is a warning and a call to arms of one kind or other. It's also, I think, a continuation of Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. His issue is with the advent of television, yours much more with the smartphone. You've been on a bit of a journey with your relationship to technology in recent years, haven't you? This has very much come about through a moment of crisis for you in your own smartphone use.
God, I mean, a moment of crisis? I think a sort of gradual realization. I guess what you're referring to is I got rid of my smartphone and got a dumb phone. I mean, the phone I have now, I guess, is more semi-dumb or semi-smart. It does quite a lot of things. This is the Unihertz Jelly Star. Highly recommended to all listeners as a good compromise. I've had dumber phones and they've been a bit impractical. It's hard to live without Spotify, without Google Maps, without the ability to text people, or, without WhatsApp. And I've had phones that can only text and make calls, and that's just not a very practical way to live in the 21st century. So this is a very good compromise. It's undistracting, but not completely useless as a tool to make your life easier. And as you say, I've publicized it a little bit, partly as an evangelist for a more tech-free way of life, partly because it never hurts the personal brand. And there certainly came a point at which I think, like most people, I realized I was very distracted by my smartphone. I mean, as a journalist, I think you're always particularly vulnerable because you have things like Twitter you're constantly assailed by the thought that people might be tweeting about you. I mean, it strikes me now as deranged in hindsight that I ever had the Twitter app on an iPhone that I carried around with me everywhere. That just seems like no way to live. And I would check it constantly, and I was very distracted, and it made it hard to read and all these things. And it just kind of crept up on me that why was I living like this? I didn't have to. I had sort of accepted the idea that I had to have a smartphone as this mandatory thing that everybody has, that everyone had to have. And I just thought, well, I'm being a complete sheep. I only have this because everyone else has it. If I was a remotely imaginative person, I would try and find a different solution and try and do something else. So I did it. And I've been through, a lot of dumb phones now looking for the right answer. I think I've found a pretty good answer. And yeah, I recommend it to everyone else. I hope that we're getting our heads around the idea that smartphones are bad, and also you don't have to have one. It is possible to live without one. And that was quite a nice realization for me.
And if it was simply a case of laying to waste your smartphone and picking up a dumb phone and no longer having to walk around with an app screaming at you, telling you that somebody had just commented on a column you'd written, that would have been fine, I suppose. But it went further than that. There was a bigger problem to address, that over time, culturally, the written word has ceded cultural power to the image and the histrionics of the smartphone, and that this is affecting our politics, our psychology, is affecting our ability to assimilate and construct argument, it's affecting our ability to understand or even tolerate one another's differing points of views. Where to begin with this book, James? Take us from ground zero of the new Dark Ages.
Oh God, well, I guess to address the point you made about where the idea came from, I was looking back recently actually to work out how long I've been writing about this stuff for. And the answer is really quite a while. I mean, it's been years now, but I've been writing about smartphones, TikTok, democracy, Neil Postman, all these things that come together in the book. And I guess it's one of those books where it sort of seems obvious that I wrote it now. But as I was casting around the idea for a book, it evidently hadn't struck me that all these ideas were in front of my eyes. I guess the other interesting thing I've found looking back on what I've written is the way the mood around technology has changed, as you say. Certainly when I was at university, there was a real mood of optimism about smartphones, about social media, and about their potential political impact. So remember around the time of the Arab Spring, we had this very, I think now, ludicrously naive idea that Twitter was going to be an instrument of democracy in the Arab world, and it was going to fell these autocrats in the Middle East and be an instrument of democracy across the world. That's proven not to be true. I realize even looking back 5 years ago when I was writing columns about the problems TikTok caused, I was getting a lot of pushback on this in a way that I'd sort of forgotten. I sort of wrote the first column I wrote about TikTok, I got cancelled with putting it too strongly, but I got a lot of mockery, and old man yelled at cloud was the kind of tenor of the response to that column on Twitter. I think that's really changed, and I think I suddenly feel like I'm moving with the tide a little bit more, and I think a lot of the slightly unreflecting default technological optimism that existed 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, has faded. And I think we are all really worried about that. I think one of the points the book tries to make is that the smartphone isn't a revolution that came out of the blue. I think there's a longer cultural story there. And I think even within the smartphone revolutions, there are more minor and more relevant revolutions. And I think one of the reasons that I felt like I suddenly began to feel like I was on the winning side of the argument, or, not winning in practical terms in the world, but an argument that was more widely accepted among people who read newspapers and things like that, I think is the rise of mobile video. And I think that's one of the important revolutions within the smartphone revolution that took place about 5 years ago, which meant that once upon a time you would look at people, you'd go on the bus and you'd go on the tube, and you'd look over people's shoulders, if you're nosy like I am, and you'd wonder what they were doing. And they were reading, they were scrolling on their phones, but often they were reading. They were reading newspaper articles, they were reading the BBC, they might be scrolling a forum on Reddit or whatever. And over the last 5 years, I think everyone has noticed that when you look over people's shoulders, they're not reading at all. They're just scrolling through TikTok, or they're watching YouTube videos. And I think for people who've been arguing that, initially television and then the internet have been bad for reading in this culture of the written word, there was for a long time a very plausible counter-argument that, aren't people reading more than they ever have been? We're all reading emails, sending emails, reading the BBC website. I think suddenly people were really aware that we had taken another gear change into a world without writing and a world without reading, and video just became totally ubiquitous because of, I think that, the basic causes, improvements in technology, which meant that you can watch video anywhere, which you couldn't do before the advent of 4G or 5G and before kind of more powerful smartphones. And I think that is why this whole anxiety has kind of acquired a bit of a mainstream purchase in the culture.
And it's all very well to look at what people consume during their leisure and realize that that may have moved from literary pursuits of even digital kinds to pure video formats. But wasn't it when you discovered how little students at university were reading or being expected to read that alarm bells really began to ring? That even in educational institutions, the premium placed on reading and reading long form was diminishing. Yeah,
absolutely. So I wrote my first article about this a few years ago now. I think it was 2023, 2022, I did a long essay for The Times talking about the decline of the humanities degree and why people were studying English literature less, why they were studying history less, why they were studying languages less. And one of the themes that really cropped up interviewing university professors and lecturers in the course of that article was that they just weren't really able to assign the long and difficult books that they'd been assigning for most of their careers. I remember one lecturer saying that basically, for most of her career as an English lecturer, she had been assigning books like Ulysses, books like Middlemarch, and she really increasingly felt that she wasn't able to do that. Her students weren't reading them, they didn't have the powers of attention, and she was beginning to have to give up on these long and difficult books. That article, as I say in the introduction to the New Dark Ages, I think turned out to be... I wasn't the only person discovering this. Over the last few years, there have been, almost on a weekly basis, there has been an article in the New Yorker or the Atlantic or some high-minded American magazine in which a journalist goes and discovers the same thing about university students, that they're not reading in the same way, that even the level of literacy seems to be falling. So it's not just they're too distracted to read, it's that when they are given a passage of text, they can't interpret and explicate it properly. Those basic skills of reading comprehension seem to have declined. And, these articles become more and more hysterical, and perhaps we don't believe every single one of them, but there are people saying, my students can't even get through a New York Times column. That I'm sure that's not everyone. That's probably I would guess that's a minority problem. But I think there's a real feeling that this complaint about university students, which once upon a time would have been automatically written off as people have always complained about students, you're just an angry old man shouting at the modern world. And, I'm willing to accept that perhaps in some ways I am, prematurely. I think people are realizing this is a real problem. And this is something that is not just a figment of the furious and fevered imagination of opinion columnists, but is an actually existing thing in the world. And the other thing to say is that there's increasingly data to back this up. A few, I think, sort of surveys that came out in the last couple of years, finding that reading for pleasure has declined by a third among British adults in 20 years. And the really striking thing is the big report from the OECD that described literacy rates declining or stagnating in the developed world, which is a really remarkable thing, that the wealthiest societies on Earth, and frankly in the history of the Earth, so advanced in so many ways, literacy rates are declining in them, is quite a remarkable thing to contemplate. And I think that gives this whole idea the sort of, the evidential undergirding that says we really should be worried about this.
So far, you've described the change, but what listeners and interested readers of this book will want to know is, what are the consequences of a post-literate society? When a society gives up on reading, what is lost? Well, what makes reading good for us in the first place?
It's a really good question. I think this is something that still feels a bit counterintuitive to a lot of people. We're so used to reading, and everybody reads, and we're surrounded by text, that I think it's easy to view reading as a kind of innate human capacity. We've all been reading since we're about 5 or 6 years old, and we can very easily forget how unusual and how special it is. The point I make at the beginning of the book is that nobody has ever encountered a human community without spoken language. There has never been a community in the history of the world that we know that has not had language. Reading and writing have been invented possibly as few as 3 times in the entire history of human civilization. These are really weird and unusual skills. And because they're so ubiquitous now, we really miss how strange and how important they are to the world that we know. A lot of the arguments about the importance of literacy come from a number of media theorists who are working in the 50s and 60s and 70s, inspired, I think, originally by the rise of radio, television, cinema, to wonder about the ways in which communicating via writing shapes human societies versus communicating, as people increasingly were, via the spoken word over radio, via increasingly television in the 1960s. People like Marshall McLuhan, Walter Ong, Neil Postman eventually. I mean, all names that are very much in the air now. I think the fact they're in the air, a testament to how basically right they were about everything.
Walter Ong's Orality and Literacy
Yes.
is a foundational text
Yes.
as part of this research, isn't it? And it's a
Yes.
fascinating text. I've read passages, but he really kind of explains how before a literate culture, you have, as you mentioned earlier, one well-versed in talking everything out.
Yeah.
But this has a very particular way of organizing society through memory, being able to persuade people through body language, through tone of voice, rather than neutrally on the page. The gulf between an oral and a literary society is really quite significant. But again, why is it so important?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's that book by Walter Ong, Orality and Literacy, I think is in certain circles increasingly ubiquitous. Rightly so. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. And his argument is that writing isn't just a way of isn't just another way of communicating, and it's not just reading isn't just a hobby. Reading and writing structure the entire way that we think about the world, and they give us access to new kinds of thought that we can't have without them. The foundation of the argument, to go into it a little bit, is that if you live in a world without reading and writing, and he says a world without reading and writing is so different, it's impossible for literate people to really conceive of or comprehend. Because we are so immersed in text, we don't fully comprehend how different a world without it would be. There are some fairly obvious points that the fundamental points about a world without writing that he makes are that if you can't write anything down, you're severely limited in what kinds of information you can preserve. So the only forms of information and knowledge you can preserve in a society without writing are in your memory. You have to, as he says, think memorable thoughts to preserve knowledge. So to store knowledge in your mind, it has to be vivid and it has to live. So societies without writing preserve knowledge not in the dry lists or encyclopedias that we would use. They have to live in the form of stories, in the form of poems with rhythmic language, in the form of rhymes, in the form of proverbs. Information has to be memorable to survive. And that not only shapes how you communicate, it shapes what you communicate, because the whole of society is based around memory. And every piece of information you preserve has to be preserved in a memorable form. So an argument made by this great classicist Eric Havelock, who very much belonged to this sort of strand of thinking about the media, one of his arguments was that Homer's epic, the Iliad, we think of it as a purely entertainment product, or not product, but we think of it as a kind of artwork or entertainment in hindsight, because for us that's what poetry does. His argument about the Iliad was that it's actually a sort of huge, memorable encyclopedia of Greek culture, and it contains in its stories and in its rhymes and in its characters ideas about our Greek culture and how it's meant to function. And that is a kind of, I think, an interesting example of the way that we forget to think about how the lack of writing reshapes an entire society, and the preservation of information shapes every aspect of a culture.
You write in The New Dark Ages, societies without writing have a yen towards the vivid, the violent, the grotesque and the monstrous. This is the starkly lit world of Greek myth, with its heroes, giants, legendary beasts, products of the oral culture of the ancient Aegean.
Yeah, so I guess if all the knowledge and information in your culture has to be preserved in the form of vivid stories and poetry, that kind of limits the range of thought that you can have. When you acquire writing, you acquire whole new ways of thinking. So as soon as you can write your thoughts down on the page, you can externalize a part of your mind, you can walk around it, you can look at it from the outside, you can probe it, you can write down a good idea, you can add it to another good idea, you can come back in a week's time and remix those ideas, turn them around again. You realize all this really powerfully writing a book. And this simple process of externalizing your brain on the page and rearranging your ideas gives you access to whole new kinds of thought. And again, I think it's the estranging omission of that book, which is such a useful one, which is that we just so easily tend to think things like history, things like philosophy, things like logic, things like science, these are just the natural expressions of human intelligence. Walter Ong said, and I think rightly, and I think he's probably being proved right as we speak, these more logical, more coherent kinds of thought are not at all inevitable to human societies. They're artificial. These are artificial kinds of thought which are created through writing. And the corollary of that as a reader is that reading is different to listening, and readers are more critical. They can examine text more closely. They can go back and forward through a text, checking logical connections, really examining and reflecting on an argument. Whereas if you're listening to someone speak, they're running away, and you can't subject every single thing they say to careful, critical analysis in the same way. So, yeah, I think that is the sort of fundamental argument I wanted to get down at the beginning of the book, which is there are certain kinds of thinking that we can't do without reading and writing. And coming back to the neuroscience point, a lot of what Walter Ong says, I think, has basically been vindicated by recent neuroscience. We know that learning any skill reorganizes your mind, but the real measurable reorganization of your brain architecture takes place when you learn to read, and it is a big thing to do to your mind to learn to read.
What do you normally order when you're here?
Oh, God, that's a good question. You would usually go for the club sandwich, but having just had a giant croissant for breakfast, I'm thinking I might go see if there's something slightly healthier to do. What are you thinking about?
I think I'm going to order the grilled chicken paillade. Avocado, harissa yogurt, soft herb salad, barberries.
That looks lovely. I mean, I'm now wondering, is it really embarrassing to order something called the Green Goddess salad live on a podcast?
Maybe you can edit it now. It's
maybe
too late.
Maybe you can edit that bit out and pretend that I've ordered something that sounds more manly than that.
You can add tofu to that if you think that will help your virility.
I actually think I might add tofu to that. It does look very good, though. I also love cauliflower. It's my favorite vegetable.
People generally are reminded of the power of writing through therapy, and there's no coincidence that the more therapeutic a culture we've cultivated, the more people have been encouraged to go back to writing for the purpose of self-healing. Therapists will advise their clients all the time to write down what they're thinking and feeling. Anyone who's done this to quell anxiety or confusion knows that writing confusion makes you less confused. But beyond that, we let go of it again, and then just sort of enjoy information in all forms through whatever takes us as far away from reading books as possible, and indeed having to write.
Yeah, the therapy point is an interesting one, and I guess it actually would connect to a lot of what people like Walter Ong and Marshall McLuhan would say about writing, which is that it tends to impose order on the world. It tends to impose structure on the world. And I think when you write, you externalize your mind, and I think probably seeing your mind from the outside can be quite a useful experience. If you're mentally distressed, I can imagine that seeing your crazy thoughts from the outside maybe allows you to get a bit of an objective perspective on them. And I think also, I mean, when you're sort of very anxious or you're worrying, you can see that thoughts are chasing their way through their minds in a kind of random blitz. I'm no stranger to this kind of thinking, and I can sort of imagine that by attempting to impose order on them, you can begin to see how logical your anxieties really are. You can, I guess get an objective perspective. It is interesting that is, I mean, to be honest, I think there's probably an argument that that's probably quite an important function of, an underrated function of writing in our society, is people doing these, morning pages or whatever they're called, frantically writing down all their anxious thoughts onto the page.
Hello, hi.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Yes.
I'd like to order the grilled chicken paillade, please.
Could I get a green goddess salad, please? Thank you. Maybe tofu. Thank you.
So in our attention economy, there's also this problem of the way in which even visual entertainment is written and structured and marketed. I recently learned about this concept of second screen viewing. According to Matt Damon, the actor who coincidentally stars in The Odyssey, scriptwriters are being told that, in his words, it wouldn't be terrible if you reiterated the plot 3 or 4 times in the dialogue because people are on their phones while they're watching. The metastasization of this problem is growing ever deeper as even visual media is having to compete with visual media. For want of a better word, it's degenerative, isn't it?
That's very well put. And I think it really is. And we've all been worrying about our attention spans for getting on for 20 years now, probably. That's been a thing. I mean, I think probably even since the advent of television, this has been a theme in our cultural conversation. But yeah, it is absolutely true that concentration is just fundamental to complex thought. If you can't follow a line of argument for more than 5 seconds, if you can't reflect on an argument in your mind and turn it over for more than 5 seconds, you really are severely limiting the kinds of thoughts and the kinds of complexity of thought that you can have. And That Matt Damon quote is in the book, actually. It's a great quote. And I think you can just see that decline of concentration reshaping our whole cultural landscape. Again, these are difficult arguments to make because everybody's getting stupider and everything's so dumb nowadays is a real, as they say, old man yells at cloud kind of case to make. But again, it's been interestingly measured. We know there's this phenomenon of, as you say, those films in which the characters are continually re-explaining what's going on in the film so that people can follow the film. There are also books. There was a good study recently, I think it was in The Economist, the New York Times, measuring the average sentence length and complexity of New York Times bestsellers has been declining steadily for about 30 or 40 years. Pop songs, the lyrics of pop songs are getting more simpler and more repetitive. The melodies of pop songs are getting simpler and more repetitive. And I think it's probably just the case that, I think it really is just the case that in a world in which you just can't concentrate, your ability to handle complexity is degraded. And that's a real problem. I know it sounds very much like the kind of thing that people have been saying forever, music's getting stupider, modern culture, it's a load of disposable crap. I really think it's true, and I think we should be worried if our level of cultural complexity is declining.
You're conscious not to sound too plaintive, even as you're talking about this, not least in the book.
Well, I mean, I always sound pretty. I am aware that I already sound pretty plaintive, so I'm trying to walk some of the plaintiveness back. I don't know how effectively.
But of course, one of the challenges you have with this book is convincing those who are going to always ask for evidence of damage done. In a chapter of the book called The Disenlightenment, IQ, you write, had been increasing steadily year on year for almost the entire 20th century. But, quote, from the end of the last century, IQ scores began to fall in many developed countries. This downward trend is known as the reverse Flynn effect. So, if your potential readers are wondering, has all this really been as bad for us as it sounds? I think there's some evidence to say there has.
Yeah, the decline of the Flynn effect is such a striking phenomenon. I mean, I guess people disagree about what IQ measures. I think it's probably not the case that IQ is measuring. It's not that like we're literally all regressing backwards through our evolutionary history to become Cro-Magnons or Neanderthals, and we're all going to start walking around with our knuckles dragging along the ground. But I do think it's a pretty significant metric. I think what it's capturing is the ability to pay attention, the sort of people's how accustomed people are to complex thought, and it's also backed up by the phenomenon of declining test scores, which I think says that, people who are inclined to dismiss IQ tests also have to think about why are PISA tests falling, this standardized measure of the proficiency of 16-year-olds internationally in maths, science, and English reading and writing. Those scores have been declining for good sort of 10, 15 years now. Cappuccino, yes, thank you very much. NEEP scores in America have, I think in literacy and maths are at their lowest level on record. These are really remarkable things that are happening. And obviously correlation isn't causation. It does seem pretty significant that all these trends seem to take off in the early 2010s, which is about the time that smartphones began to become culturally ubiquitous. The smartphone arrived in 2007. It's in the early 2010s that you begin to feel like most people have one. And that is when you see these falling test scores. It's when you see falling PISA tests, when you see falling NEEP tests. IQ maybe began a little earlier, and there's an argument, I think that's to do with television. I'm not saying, this is the 100% scientific consensus on what's going on. To me, it's an increasingly persuasive part of what's happening.
I'm aware that I'm referring to a film adaptation of a book here, but I don't suppose you've ever seen The Time Machine, based on H.G. Wells' novel.
I haven't.
There's a scene, for me, the most memorable scene, in which the man travelling far into the future meets the Eloi, a race of people who basically have extinguished all culture from civilization and live in what looks like a very benign, dreamy utopia in which everybody is beautiful and just lounges in the sun all day, eating fruits and having banal conversations. And he's asked to be shown where they keep their books. He tries to get them to understand what a book is and has to make hand gestures. And the woman that he has a bit of a thing for eventually takes him down into an underground bunker in which there are about 3 bookshelves, hardly filled with books, but there are a few there. He tries to sort of take one off and it disintegrates in his hand. It's been so neglected for so long. He kind of loses his mind at the Eloi and sort of says, what the hell have you done? Don't you realize what you've thrown away? in a sense, this is the post-literate society in
This
its
is
most
me.
kind of in its most dystopic form.
I think there are a few things to say. The first one is it's fascinating how much the disappearance of books or the fate of books is the theme of science fiction. In my book, I make a very brief reference to the first sci-fi novel ever written, potentially. An 18th century French writer, Louis-Sébastien Mercier, wrote a book called The Year 2044, which imagined life in the year 2044. And it's interesting that one of the details of the utopia he imagines is that, as in the was it H.G. Wells adaptation you mentioned, and of course in the Aldous Huxley Brave New World, which Neil Postman mentions, in which there are no books. In Louis-Sébastien Mercier's book, the first sci-fi novel ever, there are very few books. And the reason in that book is that books are so powerful and so important that they have to be strictly rationed for the population because they're so influential. And the government has decided that they're so precious and so powerful as cultural instruments, there can only be a few. So he imagines a utopia in which there are only a few books survive, and also in which this is a complete narcissistic writer's fantasy. I think he walks into the centre of Paris and every statue is of a writer or a poet or a philosopher. And I guess it's sort of interesting how this is, from the very beginning of science fiction, the fate of the written word is a theme and people are thinking about what it will look like in the future, and that's sort of interesting to reflect on. The point that I can't remember who's living without books in the Time Machine. Is it the Eloy or the Morlocks?
The Eloy.
Is that, I think it also comes back to the title of that Neil Postman book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. There was a misapprehension that a world without, these sophisticated forms of thought associated with literacy was going to be perhaps a less complex and thoughtful one, but in some ways a kind of benign and happy one where we'd all just bliss out and not bother ourselves with deep thought and just live these very superficial, very happy lives. So much of that is tied up with the snobbery of mid 20th century intellectuals, I think. What I think is really notable now is that we're not amusing ourselves to death. Nobody who has spent much time on Twitter or on social media or on TikTok, I think, is describing that as like a blissed out, relaxed, happy experience where you're being so tickled with pleasure by these machines and new forms of media that you just can't be bothered to have complex thoughts. We're living without complex thought. It's also making us incredibly unhappy at the same time. We're kind of getting the worst of both worlds. If you look at all those statistics about adolescent mental health that have been made famous and explored by Jonathan Haidt, we're not amusing ourselves to death. We're immiserating ourselves to death. So it's, in that sense, it's actually worse than Neil Postman could have imagined.
Is that why you didn't include in this book the quote from Neil Postman about why Huxley was right and Orwell was wrong? Because actually you disagree that we are amusing ourselves to death.
I sort of did think of mentioning that, and you're now making me wish that I had mentioned it. Maybe in the paperback edition they'll let me add a paragraph. I think it's a really good point, and I think perhaps, Neil Postman was right about so much, and I think we have to be just in awe of how much he understood about the world we're entering.
We really do. Look, I want people to read The New Dark Ages, of course, but please, once you've read it, go straight back to amusing ourselves to
Absolutely.
death.
And I think one of the things that he perhaps couldn't understand, because of the point of history that he was writing in, was this nature of, I think, what's sometimes called, do they call it addictive capitalism or dopamine capitalism? This world in which the aim of products is to produce compulsive behaviors in consumers. And I think
dopamine capitalism is just a tautology, to be honest. Capitalism, all forms of capitalism are basically all to do with forming habits. They're all to do with addiction.
But I think that probably wasn't quite clear. I think that probably wasn't clear in the age of television in the 1970s that Neil Postman was observing. I think it probably also wasn't clear to people making television. I think if you were a television producer or an executive in the 70s and 80s, you wanted people to watch your television channel, and perhaps you wanted to give it some of the qualities that we might not think of as addictive. But I think you fundamentally thought of yourself as belonging to an entertainment industry, and your job was to make people's lives more exciting, brighter, happier, more full of laughter. And you were thinking, not idealistically, but I think less entirely cynically than perhaps you are if you're, thank you very much, working in the modern tech industry. As I say in the book, one of the striking documents of the entertainment media of our time is the handbook produced by the YouTuber Mr. Beast. And the whole thesis of this handbook is that if you're making videos for his YouTube channel, you aren't trying to make the most entertaining videos, you aren't trying to make the best quality videos, you're trying to make the most addictive videos. I don't think even relatively cynical TV producers were quite thinking like that in the sort of 70s and 80s. I think it probably crept into television. But I think people at that time hadn't got their heads quite around the idea that entertainment could be addictive. And perhaps we shouldn't even call what we experience on our phones entertainment anymore. I think it might belong to a different genre of media. I think that guy Ted Joyer on Substack had some graph where he talked about culture gives way to entertainment, which gives way to addiction. And we should just think of it as a separate sort of, a kind of different cultural form, which is media that is intended to be addictive in quite a cynical way.
After we've eaten, we will talk about the end of democracy. And then finally, what a post-literate society could look like. Again, I know you've been very careful in this book not to be too predictive, but I'd like to push you towards the end to say a little bit more about what you fear the worst-case scenarios could be.
I'm always happy to talk about worst-case scenarios.
Enjoy your green goddess salad. It looks great, as does my paillard.
Thank you.
Was the green goddess everything that she was built up to be?
Yeah, I think so. I thought the crunchiness of the broccoli and the chewiness of the tofu worked very well together.
Do you know what? The food here is pretty good, isn't it? Let's talk about the important relationship between writing and democracy. This is another chapter of the book, and it's one that I think we would do a disservice to the listeners were we not to cover it. Writing and reading is unique to the world, as you say, that we now live in and that we understand, and to our ways of understanding it, but particularly to our ways of understanding it in a democratic civilization. Perhaps you can tell us why it's particularly unique to democracy.
Yeah, I think, again, you can quibble over correlation versus causation, but I think there is a very strong case that the arrival of the beginnings of mass literacy in the middle of the 18th century caused the rise of democracy as we know it. I think for some fairly obvious reasons. The first is obviously the dissemination of information throughout society. When everybody can read, everybody has access to information about their governments, about politics, about society, about history. And until that's the case, until information is spread equally or relatively equally among the population, the elite class will tend to have a kind of monopoly of knowledge, and a monopoly of knowledge has been a tool of every dictatorship through history. It was a point, as I say in the book, made quite explicitly by the monarchs of pre-democratic Europe who are ruling over this pre-literate Europe. It was understood that information should not be shared and disseminated among ordinary people because that posed a risk to the regime. The other really important point, I think, is that literacy brings with it, as we've been saying, critical and analytic habits of thought. And I think a culture of reading and writing is just a more critical and analytical one. And I think one of the things that you really see in the aftermath of the beginnings of mass literacy is a more critical attitude to power, a more questioning attitude to religion, a more analytic approach to questions of where does the authority to rule our country come from? And, a lot of this is the Enlightenment. But I think if you look at a lot of the questions that are being asked of power from the middle to the end of the 18th century, these are very literate-looking questions. Why is it this way? If we pin this system of government down and really try and take it apart logically, where does that get us? Does it stand up logically? And these are very literate ways of thinking about power. So that's the other crucial thing. So I think we can say that the rise of literacy was one of the major factors in the rise of democracy as we know it. I don't think you get modern democracy without mass literacy. The other point is that literacy not only, brings democracy into being, I think it sustains it. When we argue, as we've been saying, through the medium of a printed text, it tends to lower the temperature. Arguing face-to-face is much angrier and much less logical. If you're arguing via print, you tend to have more rational conversations. And all those critical, analytic, evidence-based forms of thought are really, really good for democracy, because no democracy is perfect, and you can become unduly dewy-eyed and idealistic about what a literate democracy should look like. It's not the case that everybody is like a political philosopher opening up their broadsheet newspaper every morning and analysing the latest proceedings of Parliament last night. But I think certain habits of analysis, of dispassionate logical thought are essential to democracy. And I think, as I said in the book, if democracy looks to be in trouble in the world now, as we know it is, I think the fading of that culture is a really big part of it, probably the predominant part, to be honest.
We've already spoken about what the histrionics of our visually mediated culture produces. I've noticed that there's been a bit of a trend of people who are taking videos of people speaking in the House of Commons and then asking people to watch them without the sound on. What they're always trying to point out, it seems, is that the way that someone bares their teeth or moves their head is indicative of a certain type of person who you should despise politically the way I do. I mean, again, when you take literacy out of the equation, what you have is a lot of physicality, either grotesque judgment of a person's character based on how they look, or indeed violence, or the possibility of violence. But when it comes to the end of democracy, democracy often alludes to anti-elitism, but it sounds to me like in order to protect democracy, you're saying that actually we need to reintroduce a kind of elitism.
That's one way of framing it. And this is another question that I sort of began to address in the book, and then I thought this will just produce another chapter of discursive running off down the side and going in an unhelpful direction. My argument actually is that I think social media is fundamentally anti-democratic. I think there's an obvious equation that we make in our heads, is that on Twitter or on TikTok, everybody can speak and everybody has the right to speak. Therefore, this is the most democratic possible solution to the public sphere. The most democratic possible public sphere is the public sphere in which more people can speak. I would dispute that, actually. I think the most democratic public sphere is a sphere in which people have access to the best information. And I think a more democratic culture is one in which good quality information is diffused through as many people in the population as possible. So I think...
But that has to be protected and asserted and verified by those who have an interest in doing so.
Yes, and I think it's a democratic principle that in a democratic society, all citizens have a right to information produced by experts and people who understand it, rather than to nonsense. And I think that is the more democratic situation. I also think the idea that we've got rid of gatekeepers and replaced it with this more democratic culture is a bit of an illusion. We still have gatekeepers, but they're called algorithms. And it's not the case that you can go onto Twitter and say anything you like and it will be treated as another democratic voice added to the crowd. And if you've made a good point, it'll rise to the top. The algorithms are just as harsher, to be honest, in the kinds of voices they select for. And
you can't argue with them.
And you can't argue with them. And there are obvious criticisms to be made of the old gatekeeping class, but algorithms have their own biases. And if, our old media class was perhaps a little prone towards selecting for voices that came from a certain class background or had been educated at certain universities, algorithms select for, as we know all too well, angry voices, deranged voices, voices full of misinformation. And I don't think that's any more democratic than the old gatekeeping class.
We haven't yet, I think, caught up to the point that you're alluding to, which is where we realise that it is better to be ruled by people that you can argue with, that you can disprove, that you can even expose for being frauds, than algorithms.
And also, people are just less cynical than algorithms. Nobody goes into journalism thinking, my mission in journalism, and obviously the journalists have a little bit of this to their characters, but nobody goes in thinking 100% of my mission in journalism is to produce rage and anger and misinformation and fury and confusion. Human beings, we would like to tell positive stories about ourselves, and I think most people would go into journalism thinking, I want to have some kind of positive impact in the world. No one goes into television thinking, all I want to do is make people watch television as much as possible, regardless of how meaningless that is. They want to entertain people, they want to at least think they're making people's lives better. Algorithms and computers don't have those impulses at all, and a Twitter algorithm has no aspiration to make the world more democratic or to diffuse good information more evenly through society. It's just set up to promote engagement, and therefore not only can you not argue with it, it's an entirely cynical actor in our culture. And to have a wholly cynical actor it's only optimizing for engagement is a really new thing. Our culture has been organized by human beings for the entire of history until like 5 minutes ago. And the idea that we've asserted these completely cynical machines into the middle of our public discourse is a really new idea and a really dangerous idea. And I think people need to get used to thinking of algorithms as gatekeepers, not just as inevitable facts of the universe. As I think people can still slip into thinking, the content that does well is the democratically selected popular content, but that's not quite true.
I agree. On the other hand, I do think that the algorithm is basically a human cynicism perfected. We are still to blame, aren't we?
Yes.
In the way that we've been evaluating and quantifying value for a long time.
I think that is absolutely true. And I think also the problem is, as we were saying earlier, a capitalist culture of competition in the 1990s was promoting a similar sort of proto-algorithmic attitude to content in cable television channels. They knew that if they wanted to retain viewers and attract viewers, they had to produce the most fast-paced, the most angry, the most shocking, vivid kinds of content. And that process was already in train. Yeah, and I think you're right to say that the algorithm is like the ultimate consummation of that way of thinking, in which our only mission as people in the media is to attract eyeballs. And we do not care at what cost we attract eyeballs. We just want the eyeballs because we want the advertising money. I think that's true to say, yeah.
You write at the very end of this book, a post-literate society will not be one in which people become literally incapable of reading and writing. Those who've listened to this episode might be thinking, well, that's bloody well what it sounds like. And you've been careful throughout not to predict too vividly. But I want to press you on what you think the worst-case scenario could be if the contents of this book were entirely ignored and society just doubles down on the current trajectory.
Yeah, well, I can't imagine a world in which the contents of my book are entirely ignored. Surely that could never happen.
He says as he peels it off the shelf in an Eloy future.
I mean, in a way, the dystopian vision of the future that this book hints at is kind of upon us. By all kinds of metrics, and I'm afraid I can't remember the exact figures, democracy is in quite steep decline over the last 20 years. We're not directly exposed to it in the UK in the same way, and it's easy to think, oh, well, we've got a new prime minister, parliament still meets, we're not at threat from this. In plenty of countries in the world, people are losing democratic rights. America obviously is still a democracy, but it's slid in a very undemocratic direction in recent years. And I think if you look around the world, the kinds of autocratic movements that are triumphing and the kinds of anti-democratic movements that are really have momentum behind them in the world today, they are post-literate in my view. And I think what I mean by that is that the great threat to democracy in the 21st century is not an ideology like fascism or communism. Ideologies often require ideas and arguments and writing. The word that's often used to describe the 21st century autocratic moment is personalism, which is a kind of power based on the personality of a leader, which is based on a charismatic individual who I think in some ways resembles a medieval king or a pre-democratic king, a very powerful, strong, central figure who has almost a kind of mystical relationship with the people, often is the idea. And I think this is so much to do with the smartphone. One of the examples I use in the book is the dictator of El Salvador, Bukele. He calls himself the world's coolest dictator and is apparently the world's most followed leader on TikTok. If you look at his communication strategy, it's perfect for TikTok. As we've been saying, visual media favors personalities. It favors spectacle. It does not favor critical and analytic thought. And if you are communicating with people via video, via TV, via TikTok, all that is required for you, you don't have to make an argument for you should be in power. You don't have to persuade people logically as you might if you're writing an article. All that is required is the spectacle of you, the charismatic central individual. And this is visible across the world. Every country that is suffering from democratic backsliding has at its heart a charismatic individual who is overruling the systems of the state by the force of their personality. I mean, the really telling, Donald Trump is a preeminent example of this, someone who got his start on television, someone whose entire appeal depends not on that he's making like the best, in my view, economic arguments to America, not the person who's making the most cogent case about how American society should change. He is the most charismatic, the most spectacular personality, the personality that translates perhaps better than anyone in America onto a screen. And that is the direction in which smartphones are taking us, I think. And, thank God, democracy in the UK still exists. This story isn't just about us. I think we shouldn't be blind to the fact that a lot of people are already living in what we might describe as the dystopian future, whereby their democracies are succumbing to a kind of highly charismatic, personalist autocracy. That's happening now, and we should be very aware of that.
You're obviously convinced about the value of literacy and writing and a reading culture. You also sound, in the same breath, convinced of the value of democracy. Are you beyond skepticism on that?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, you'd be mad to be a sort of completely rosy-eyed about democracy. But, the Winston Churchill quote, it's the best system apart from all the others that have ever been tried. And I think you have to recognize that democracy comes with certain inbuilt weaknesses and problems. just as any system of government does, and it's the best way of governing ourselves we've invented, and I think crucial to making it work properly and crucial to making sure that it doesn't degrade and it doesn't dissolve into this kind of autocratic personalism that we've been talking about is literacy, and is making sure that people are informed and critical as they possibly can be. And I don't think you can have an effective democracy, or perhaps even a democracy at all, without that.
I think that may be another demographic you're going to have to convince. As you know, there is a rise of anti-democratic feeling among younger generations, but that may be an entire conversation we could have separate from the one we've had today. Thank you very much, James, for joining me on the Booking Club, and congratulations on your first and a very important book, The New Dark Ages, The End of Reading and the Dawn of a Post-Literate Society.
Thank you very much for having me.